Good morning, everybody. I would like to call the first speaker if the chair permits me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Upon Dr. Lakshmi Mail Vathanam and the presenting author, Dr. Nivyan, for impact of microalbuminuria and reduced GFR on retinopathy among type 2 diabetic patients. So, Dr. Nivyan, please.
I request all the judges just to take the name of the presenting author and the free paper number to save time.
Sure.
Yes. This is
This
free
is
paper
207. Free paper 207. Dr. Nivyan, please.
Good morning, ma'am. This is Dr. Lakshmi here. I will be the presenting author, ma'am. I have requested for a change. They said they will do. I'm the chief author and I'll be the presenting author.
Please go ahead. Please.
I'm sharing my screen. So my paper is about impact of microalbuminuria and reduced estimated glomerular filtration rate on retinopathy among type 2 diabetic patients. It's a population-based cross-correction study. I have no financial interest in the material discussed. Show the relationship between chronic kidney disease and diabetic retinopathy in representative population of type 2 diabetes mellitus patients in a diabetic center in Tamil Nadu. This was a population-based cross-sectional study, and a total of 100 patients, males to female, of 83 to 17, with a mean duration of type 2 diabetes of 14 years, who had recorded ophthalmologic and renal function examinations spanning a period of 12 months were evaluated. Data were obtained from a primary healthcare electronic database of medical records, and all the subjects had undergone fundus photography for DR and EGFR and UACR for diabetic nephropathy. Statistical methods, the data collected is entered into Excel sheet, and the descriptive statistical analysis has been carried out in the present study. Results on continuous measurements are presented on mean and plus or minus standard deviation. Results on categorical measurements are presented in percentage. Chi-square test, Fisher exact test were used to find the significant association of study parameters. All the analyses are two-tailed, and P less than 0.05 is considered significant. Inclusion criteria: patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus and CKD with EGFR of less than 60 or UACR more than 30 was included. Exclusion criteria: patients with other specific types of diabetes, type 1 diabetes, gestational, and subjects with incomplete laboratory data were excluded. And the diagnosis of diabetic nephropathy was made by the diabetologist, and CKD is defined as UACR more than 30 or EGFR less than 60. Renal failure is defined as UACR more than 300 or EGFR less than 30. Normoalbuminuria is where UACR is less than 30, and microalbuminuria is 30 to 299, and macroalbuminuria is more than 300. Retinal examination was performed in all the subjects. Fundus photography was taken to document diabetic retinopathy, followed by FFA to confirm findings if necessary. Diabetic retinopathy was classified based on International Clinical Diabetic Retinopathy and Diabetic Macular Edema Severity Scales. Results: the whole sample included more males, 83%, which does in fact reflect the prevalence of diabetes in the population as a whole. The mean current age was 63 years and diabetic duration was 14 years. HbA1c was 8.3 and creatinine 2.1, with mean EGFR of 42.25 and UACR was 81.6. In patients with DM with CKD, we observed a prevalence of 39% for any DR, with NPDR of 33% and 6% of PDR. And this is a tabulation between EGFR and AC ratio. The proportion of higher AC ratio, that is 151 to 300, is significantly increasing across the stages of EGFR values, with a probability of 0.016, which is significant. AC ratio with diabetic retinopathy relationship, the probability was 0.84% and 84, and though the significant association is not there, the proportion of diabetic retinopathy is relatively higher in AC ratio with 151 to 300 compared to AC ratio with 30 to 150. That is 41.6%. And comparing EGFR with the diabetic retinopathy, P is equal to 0.575, which is not significant. And comparing EGFR along with AC ratios with diabetic retinopathy, the P value is 0.002, which is significant. There is a significant association which is observed between EGFR and AC ratio among the diabetic retinopathy patients. So DR is characterized by microvascular abnormalities leading to development of non-proliferative and proliferative diabetic retinopathy and macular edema. And diabetic nephropathy is a life-threatening complication which predisposes to excess morbidity and mortality resulting from renal failure and cardiovascular disease. In our study, UACR was increased significantly than EGFR with increasing severity of diabetic retinopathy. In a similar study reported by Poncelos et al., who carried out a cross-section study based on 28,344 patients, demonstrated that prevalence of DR increases in patients with UACR more than 300 and with a positive relation between the decrease in EGFR and sight-threatening DR. A prospective 10-year follow-up population-based study using the chronic kidney disease epidemiology collaboration equation concluded that UACR is a better association with diabetic retinopathy than EGFR. The greatest significance of UACR in type 2 diabetic patients compared with type 1 was encountered in a previous study. EGFR is a less significant factor than UACR in two ways. Changes in EGFR occur prior to an increase in UACR, and arteriosclerosis, which can occur in parallel to diabetes, can decrease the glomerular filtration rate in patients with normoalbuminuria. The emergence of non-proteinuric diabetic retinopathy and reduced association between retinopathy and kidney disease in type 2 patients could be due to a rise in prevalence of the renal vascular disease. In conclusion, CKD was associated with a high rate of DR. When we analyzed the association between different levels of UACR and DR prevalence, we observed that DR prevalence rose with the increase of UACR levels, and this association was significant from UACR values more than 30 and increased considerably with EGFR levels less than. Results show that CKD, high UACR and low EGFR appear to be associated with diabetic retinopathy in this type 2 diabetes population. UACR is underutilized at present, can be used as a better predictor for diabetic nephropathy. The present study highlights the need for screening the patients periodically to look for diabetic complications. In conclusion, patients with diabetic retinopathy should undergo an evaluation of renal function and vice versa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nivian, for an excellent presentation. Now I would like to know from the chairman, is there any question for her?
Yes. What do you feel the practicality of this? The data what you showed us, Dr. Sangeeta?
Dr. Lakshmi.
Sorry, Dr.
Sir,
Lakshmi. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Sir, actually, the UACR, it requires only a spot urine test, which is practically very feasible than an estimated glomerular filtration rate, which needs the serum creatinine, and then they titrate it according to the age and the sex. So this is a more simpler test, and since the glomerular filtration rate, any vascular disease or any hypertension also can decrease the EGFR. That is the creatinine, it's basically secreted from the proximal tubules. So a spot urine test can give you the UACR values, and it's more specific for diabetic kidney disease rather than EGFR, which is very common in other conditions also. So this predicts the prognosis of the diabetic nephropathy also, and with increasing UACR, the diabetic retinopathy also progresses. So it's a very good prognostic factor, sir. And since it's a spot urine test and it's a very simple test, it's very feasible in practical situations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nivian. So can we proceed on to the next paper? That is free paper 331, correlation of severity of visual impairment with the RNFL thickness in demyelinating diseases. So Dr. Varun, please.
Dr. Varun, could you start your screen sharing?
Yes, sir.
Can you hear us?
Hello.
He's working on it. Okay.
Okay.
Varun has to set up. We can take the next paper.
Yeah, sorry for the interference. Can you please take a 5-minute time
Dr.
for
Manisha,
the
please
sector?
start with the next
Yeah,
paper.
yeah. We can call next speaker, Dr. Vignesh, if he's there. Free paper
Yes, ma'am. Good morning.
Yeah, your presentation.
Yeah, can I'll just share my screen. Good morning, all. My topic is eplerenone for chronic central serous chorioretinopathy with cystoid macular edema. No financial disclosure. The purpose was to evaluate the efficacy of eplerenone in the treatment of chronic central serous chorioretinopathy with cystoid macular edema. It was a retrospective interventional case series. 9 eyes of 6 patients with chronic CSER with cystic macular edema were included, and they were given oral eplerenone, 25 milligram once daily, and at least they had a follow-up of 6 months. Fundus fluorescent angiography and the spectral domain OCT had been done for all these patients. Central macular thickness and SRF levels were recorded at baseline and every follow-up visit. Serum potassium also was measured in all these patients and recorded at baseline and follow-up visits. Patients were given a tablet eplerenone 25 milligram once daily for a period of at least 6 months in these patients. The results, like all the patients had a history of previous treatment with focal laser or transcutaneous thermotherapy. 3 eyes of 2 patients had complete resolution of SRF and CME. 7 eyes of 4 patients had complete resolution of subretinal fluid. 3 eyes of 2 patients had complete resolution of cystoid macular edema. And 2 eyes had a reduction in SRF as well as CME. No adverse effects were observed in these patients, and no hyperkalemia was also noted in these patients. Wilcoxon sign rank test was used. Best corrected visual acuity was conducted to logmark for analysis, and there was no statistically significant difference in best corrected visual acuity between baseline and follow-up at 6 months. However, there were statistically significant difference in central macular thickness between baseline and final follow-up at 6 months. And also, there was a statistically significant difference in SRF level between the baseline and final follow-up at 6 months. Presenting few patients who had been given this eplerenone. Like here, we are seeing a chronic CSER with multiple leaks, and the duration was around 1 year, and the baseline best corrected visual acuity was 612. So at presentation, there was fluid, cystoid spaces, subretinal fluid, and exactly in 2 months, like there was complete resolution in both the fluid as well as cystoid spaces, and that continued for another 6 months. In the left eye of the same patient, again, like the teardrop CSER with already treated few scars were noted for previous laser. Here we can see the cystoid spaces as well as the fluid, which was decreasing like in the second month, as well as again there was a slight increase in the 4th month. Again, there was a decrease. So the fluid has decreased, and also the cystoid spaces has decreased very well in the left eye. So this patient was also on eplerenone for 6 months. In the second case, in the right eye, there was again a scar here, like noted the window defect with diffuse leakage. Here you can see the fluid as well as the cystoid space, CME, which resolved in 2 months. Again, this continued until 6 months. There was no fluid or no recurrence of the cystoid spaces. In the same patient, the left eye, there were multiple leaks. Noted as large subretinal scarring was there. Fibrotic scarring was seen. Here you can see this diffuse like a large cyst with the fluid and a PED, and there was a resolution in both the cyst and the fluid. In the third patient, again, multiple scars due to the previous treatment as well as the leakage. And here also there was a very good decrease in the fluid level, completely resolved, but also decrease in the cystoid macular level, like from the baseline compared to the 6 months. In the same patient, the left eye, again, there was a smokestack leak was noted. The baseline vision was 6.9. So the vision was maintained. The fluid had decreased completely, and however, cystoid spaces remained here with the PED still remaining. In the case 4, like you can see here, large cystoid spaces with fluid at baseline. Again, there was no reduction at 2 months. However, the reduction started at 4 months, and there was very minimal at the 6 months. In the case 5, there was not significant improvement in this patient. 618 vision and 387 central macular thickness. SRF at the fovea was nil, but however, this patient worsened even after treatment with oral eplerenone at 6 months. Coming to discussion, like cystoid macular edema is seen in severe forms of chronic CSER. The pathogen is thought to be lying in the outer blood retinal barrier breakdown and deranged active fluid drainage due to a dysfunctional RPE layer. Visual acuity is usually poor in cases of chronic CSER with CME and does not improve even after treatment due to the foveal RPE degeneration. Spontaneous resolution of cystoid macular edema in chronic CSER is rare. Therefore, treatment of CSER before the occurrence of CME is advisable. We know that like eplerenone has been shown to be effective in the treatment of chronic CSER in recent studies. Mohammadi et al. Had shown that PDT was effective in CSER with complete resolution of CME in around 54% of cases. In a case report on the use of oral eplerenone in CSCR, both as SRF and IRF remained persistent. And another study where the subset analysis they had done, there was a resolution of CME in 3 out of 6 eyes. In our study, there was a resolution of SRF in 7 out of 9 eyes at the end of 6 months, and the complete resolution of CME in 3 out of 9 eyes. That is around 33.3%. However, our study had a limitation of lesser number of cases and shorter follow-up. Our study has shown a modest beneficial effect of eplerenone on the treatment of CSCR with cystoid macular edema with resolution of SRF as well as reduction in CME. However, a large prospective study is warranted to study the efficacy of eplerenone in chronic CSCR with cystoid macular edema. These are my references. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Vignesh, for this excellent presentation. Now it is open for any discussion.
Yeah, Vignesh, good presentation. And basically, it's reducing the secondary, like maybe it's a, pathogenesis of the CSCR rather than reducing the CME and other factor, because they are all secondary side effects. Just wanted to know, and it will be a good tool when we don't have PDT as a choice of treatment right now in our armamentarium. If you want to choose, as like a baseline criteria, what all patients will like to choose? All chronic CSCR, or there is any particular specialty will you strictly want to rule them out for starting on this therapy?
Sir, and all chronic CSCRs, so like eplerenone is a good choice, sir. As we don't have PDT right now, the only other option is micropulse laser. But if we have bilateral cases with diffuse leakage or multifocal leaks, then eplerenone will be a good choice, sir. So only the limiting step will be like if they are having like other systemic comorbidities where we cannot use eplerenone, then we have to consider micropulse laser. Otherwise, like eplerenone as a monotherapy in these patients are found to be beneficial in my other studies I'm currently doing, sir.
Good. That's what I wanted to say. Multifocal CSR will be a better option to start on treatment. So thank you very much for your presentation. Let's move on to the next paper, please.
Thank you, sir.
So back to Dr. Varun, you are ready? Free paper 331, correlation of severity of visual impairment with RNFL, thickness and demyelinating diseases. So let's start.
Good morning to the faculty. Is my screen
The
visible?
screen is visible and you're audible.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Good morning, respected judges. Today, my topic for paper presentation is correlation of severity of visual impairment with RNFL thickness and demyelinating diseases. There is no financial interest. Starting with the introduction, the RNFL is composed mainly of unmyelinated axons of retinal ganglion cells, which become myelinated within the optic nerve to form a white matter tract and convey the visual information from the retina to the lateral geniculate nucleus. Measurements of the RNFL therefore give relatively direct measures of the number of axons present. Axonal loss has been recognized in the RNFL in early stages of demyelinating diseases such as MS and NMO. Brief introduction about the demyelinating diseases. MS is a demyelinating relapsing remitting inflammation in which axonal loss is the major cause of irreversible neurological disability. Nearly half of the patients develop optic neuritis, and it is a heralding event in 15 to 20% of the patients. Even without a history of optic neuritis, the RNFL by OCT in MS is typically thinner than in normal controls. Neuromyelitis optica, another type of demyelinating disease with predilection for optic nerve and spinal cord, has a devastating and distinct cause from multiple sclerosis. Third is the clinically isolated syndrome. It is often the first manifestation of MS, which typically affects the optic nerve, brain, and spinal cord. To be termed as CIS, the episode should last for at least 24 hours and should occur in absence of fever or infection with no clinical features of encephalopathy. So, what's the role of OCT in demyelinating diseases? It has enabled measurement of peripapillary RNFL loss with micron-level resolution and excellent reproducibility. OCT employs low coherence interferometry to generate non-invasive in vivo high-resolution cross-sectional images of the RNFL by measuring backscatter of the infrared light. It was a cross-sectional observational study carried out in the Department of Ophthalmology, Indore. The sample size included 60 eyes of 30 patients above 20 years of age with diagnosed cases of MS, NMO, and CIS who had previous attack of optic neuritis. Patients having severe cognitive dysfunction and unwilling to give consent were excluded. All OCT imaging was obtained by a single observer. It was acquired by taking 3 circular 3.4 mm diameter scans entered on the optic disc, the mean of which was used to express the RNFL thickness, and the average value of 3 different measurements or quadrants were calculated. The overall data obtained in all the quadrants were identified as RNFL overall. The sectors were defined in clockwise order for right eye and counterclockwise for the left eye. Following ranges were assigned for overall RNFL thickness measured by OCT. Results. A total of 30 subjects completed the study, 6 of NMO, 6 of CIS, and 18 of MS in 18 months. Chi-square test was used for intergroup analysis of RNFL thickness. The demographic profile of the 3 groups showed a female preponderance in each group with mean age in the range of 25 to 45 years. After a clinical episode of optic neuritis, the overall unadjusted mean RNFL thickness was lesser in as compared to NMO was significantly lower than those with MS, while the patients with CIS had the highest RNFL thickness. This is the mean value of the patients of MS, NMO, and CIS, in which we can see that the NMO patient has the overall lowest RNFL thickness following an attack of optic neuritis. While in fellow eye, it was found that the mean RNFL thinning in MS patient is significantly greater than the fellow eyes of NMO patients. This is the data of the MS, NMO, and CIS. These RNFL thickness, their association were tested with the visual functions by using the Spearman correlation coefficient, and it was found that the severity of visual acuity very well correlated with the severity of RNFL thinning and was statistically significant in affected as well as the fellow eyes. While examining quadrant-wise, it was observed that the temporal and nasal quadrants were thinner in NMO. The superior and inferior quadrant were not affected. Discussion. The demographic details revealed female preponderance with mean age being 25 to 45 years, which was consistent with the previous studies carried out by Charles Weller et al. Our study demonstrated that optic neuritis occurred unilaterally in these diseases with only 2 cases showing reduced color vision. Pupillary reaction was found to be sluggish ill-sustained in 18 eyes and brisk ill-sustained in 7 eyes, while 7 eyes demonstrated RAPD. These findings corroborated with the study of Miller et al. Rachford et al. In their study confirmed the occurrence of greater loss of RNFL thickness in MS patients, where Susan Novel et al. Found that all patients of CIS had normal overall RNFL thickness. Our study also found that the temporal and nasal quadrants were affected to a greater magnitude, while the superior quadrant were demonstratively different, indicating of the affection of the papillomacular bundle. Naismith RT agreed on the fact that there is a critical value of RNFL thickness below which the visual acuity decreases. The critical value has been set at 71.41 micron. Below 50 to 52 micron, the vision drops to less than 20/100. And severity of visual acuity very well correlated with the severity of RNFL thinning. Conclusion is, OCT has provided a basis for correlating structural aspects of anterior visual pathway, and hence evaluating the axonal damage, severity of visual impairment by measuring RNFL thickness loss using OCT is extremely useful in assessing the progression of visual loss. These are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Varun.
Thank you, ma'am.
So any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Varun, for a nice presentation and observation as well. So do you find any challenges on the fixation when you are doing OCT, where these patients are able to fix quite well for the RNFL measurement, or any special tricks are there for that? Because the vision loss is, yeah.
So those who were not able to fix it, or those who have any media opacity or signal strength less than 6/10 were not included in our study. Although they were the diagnosed case of MS and NMO, but due to the less signal strength or any other artifact, we didn't include in our study.
No, even in normal patients, say for example, a fresh optic neuritis, sometimes you will have these kind of challenges where patients are not able to fix it. So any special considerations you suggest, or you have, you have tried to think over it?
Sorry, sir, I haven't.
Even
thought
for
about it.
fresh optic nerve cases, there is sometimes, when you want to measure the RNFL thickness, there are some challenges related to the fixation for this particular patient. So do you advise any special considerations for this criteria?
So we can take an average of 3 to 4 scans.
Okay, no problem. Thank you so very much. Let's move on to the next paper. I think Dr. Manisha will be presenting now. Yes.
Yes.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Manisha, are you ready? This will be free paper 524.
I have to share my screen. So
Yes, please share it.
I think Dr. Varun has to unshare first.
Your screen is visible, ma'am.
Okay. I see.
To save time, I would request the next speaker also to keep the PowerPoint presentation ready. Thank you so much. We would just like to keep it on time.
Can you see? Can you see my slides?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
You can go ahead.
Okay.
Ma'am, please slide so ma'am.
Slide share. I can't see this.
Can you press the F5, ma'am, please?
Slide share.
F5, F5. F5, ma'am.
Yeah. What is that?
1 minute is already over.
Yeah.
मैम डाउन में आइए राइट हैंड साइड पे हाँ और बस कर दीजिए क्लिक करिए ओके
Right. I think. So my presentation is on platelet count and width as a upcoming biomarker for high risk cases of BRVO in cases of hypertension. So introduction, I would like to say retinal vein occlusion is the second most common vascular disorder after diabetic retinopathy, and it's an important sudden painless unilateral visual loss. The risk factors we all know are advancing age, increased intraocular pressure, hypertension, diabetes mellitus, hyperlipidemias, pregnancy, and oral contraceptives. So the role of platelets. Platelets play a pivotal role in the pathology of hypertension, an important risk factor. It can cause a retinal vein occlusion. Assessment of platelet indices and their biomarkers are of vital importance for hypertension-induced vascular injury. Aim and objectives to study the clinical profile of BRVO patients and its relationship with platelet indices in the hypertensive patients. Material and methods, prospective case control. Sample size was 50 patients of BRVO with hypertension and 50 age and sex matched controls were taken in the ratio of 1:1. There was no statistically significant difference between cases and controls with respect to gender, systolic and diastolic blood pressure, blood glucose, and cholesterol levels. Exclusion criteria was open for glaucoma, ocular hypertension, poor optical media, diabetes mellitus, cardiovascular disease, renal disease, hyperhomocystinemia, and blood dyscrasias. We took history, onset, duration of symptoms, systemic medical history, SDOCT scan, the macular thickness, and the patients were screened for patients for any abnormal vitreoretinal interface abnormalities. Blood samples were collected from both the groups under aseptic conditions at the time of diagnosis using a 2% ETA and was analyzed within an hour of sampling. 5-part cell analyzer were used to measure the complete hemogram. Investigations included lipid profile, random blood glucose levels, urea, serum creatinine. The data was collected and tabulated using Microsoft Excel database. Students' t-test and man-witness U-test were taken, and chi-square test was used to compare categorical variables. and the results were tabulated accordingly. Out of 50 BRVO patients, there was significant male preponderance with a male to female ratio of 1.38:1. Majority of patients were 51 to 55 years, and mean age was 53 in cases, and controls it was 52.8. So macular edema was quantified by SGOCT and was present in 60% of cases with CME. Biochemical parameters were not clinically significant or statistically significant, I would say. Platelet indices were measured, and platelet count and platelet distribution width were the two indices which were found to be statistically significant in this study. And the platelet count was reduced in cases than controls, while PDW, that is the width, was found to be higher in BRVO cases. So discussion, I would say branch retinal vein occlusion is considered to be the most common among retinal vein occlusions, with an incidence of 0.5 to 1.2 per 100. 16 million people in the world are suffering from vascular disorders of eye, and BRVO is 4 times more common. Arteriosclerosis is the predominant mechanism for the development of RVO, but exact mechanism is still not known. It is due to the compression of veins at AV crossings, therefore most predominant in the superior temporal BRVO, as maximum number of AV crossings are there. It can also be due to degenerative changes within venous walls along with hypercoagulability. We found that atherosclerosis or hypertension is a major cause of pathophysiology of BRVO. This causes endothelial dysfunction and thrombocyte activation. Since BRVO is a disease that goes with thrombosis and inflammatory processes, these are the main markers involved. Platelet indices include main platelet volume, platelet count, platelet distribution, and platelet crit. So we found that alteration in platelet count indicates cardiovascular involvement. Platelet count was significantly lower in the BRVO cases that we had than the hypertensive controls. Similarly, results were shown in such study conducted by Sahin et al., and they concluded that platelet counts were significantly reduced in BRVO than hypertensive controls. Mean platelet volume has a nonlinear relationship with platelet count. Value ranges from 9.4 to 12. In our study, MPV was higher in BRVO cases than hypertensive controls, but this difference was not statistically significant. Platelet distribution width is a marker of platelet activation. Platelet activation increases platelet distribution width due to cytosis. Conclusion is platelet play an important role in hypertensive vascular injury. The present study shows statistically significant alteration of platelet count and PDW in BRVO cases, and is a future biomarker. This supports the hypothesis that BRVO is due to vascular important imbalance or injury mediated by platelet triggered by hypertension. Thank you so very much.
Good paper, Dr. Manisha. Just wanted to ask, is there any correlation between ischemic versus non-ischemic BRVO also in this case? Have you looked into that?
Yeah, we took non-ischemic cases, but a few of the cases they converted on to ischemic also once there was some thromboembolic phenomena going on. So from posterior to anterior, we found that in few cases we had this non-ischemic to ischemic. And this also is the indication that there is a hypertensive injury going on. Whenever there is a platelets alteration, there is activation, then these are more important causes for non-ischemic going into ischemic causes.
Okay, thank you so very
Dr.
much.
Manoj, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
We have a keynote address by Dr. Rajesh in between. So we'll take that keynote address now, and then we'll continue.
Whenever you're okay. It's up to you.
Dr.
Whenever
Rajesh, are you ready? Dr. Rajesh, Priyam? You have to unmute Priyam.
So Dr. Rajesh will be in the next session. His keynote will be in the next session.
Okay, so we go ahead with the papers. Sorry, Manoj,
Yes,
go ahead
yes.
with the papers.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. Just a small request, Dr. Manisha, because you were a presenter in this session, so you be online with us. Sorry
Yes,
for that.
Sir, I would now request the free paper 934, impact of subfoveal choroidal thickness on clinical outcomes in polypoidal choroidal vasculopathies. So presenting author is Dr. Ramesh. I hope he's there.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning, Ramesh. Please go ahead.
Are my slides visible?
Yes, visible.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. So my paper today is going to be on the impact of subfoveal choroidal thickness on clinical features and long-term outcomes in PCVs. I have no financial disclosures to make. we know PCV is an exudative retinal disease which is characterized by a thick foveal, subfoveal choroid with dilated choroidal vessels, presence of a neovascular network between the RPE and the Brooks membrane, and there is an hyperreflectivity between the RPE and the Brooks membrane suggestive of a branching vascular network. Currently, the PCV classifications are based on number of imaging modalities, primarily on the angiography, on the basis of fluorescein, indocyanine green, and on basis of OCT angiography as well. But subfoveal choroidal thickness is another way of classifying PCVs, where on the basis of the choroidal thickness at the fovea, we can classify the PCVs with thin choroid, medium level choroid, and thick choroid. Why we use the subfoveal choroidal thickness is basically it has been used to evaluate the visual outcome in a number of retinal diseases like DME and CSCR. And when we had looked at the literature, there was a similar paper which spoke about the comparison of clinical features and the 3-month follow-up in different choroidal thickness in PCV. And what they found was that these eyes with thin choroid usually had a worse visual outcome than eyes with a medium and thick choroid. But the flip of this paper was it did not have long-term follow-ups and the evaluation was done at 3-month treatment. So in this study, we wanted to look at the clinical features and the long-term clinical outcomes in patients with PCV in eyes with different subfoveal choroidal thickness. So coming to the methodology, this was a retrospective observational comparative study of patients diagnosed with ICG as PCV in treatment-naive cases between January 2011 to June 2019. And these were the patients who underwent ocular examination with visual acuity, slit lamp examination, and imaging test with color imaging, color fundus imaging, and EDI, OCT, and fluorescein and indocyanine green angiography. So the diagnostic criteria for PCV was based on the Everest 2 guidelines, where it said that you have to have an orangish nodular lesion, which is identified on the ICG as hyperfluorescence, and they should have remaining one of the minor criteria, such as the presence of a branching vascular network, a pulsatile polyp, a hypofluorescent halo, or orangish nodule, and associated with a massive submacular hemorrhage. These were the exclusion criteria. That means the cases which did not fit into the diagnosis of PCV were excluded. And on evaluation, we evaluated the patients based on the clinical examination, on the angiography, and on OCT, where on the angiography, we looked for the number and the location of the polyps, the presence of branching vascular network, presence of dilated hyperpermeable choroidal vessels, and leakage from the branching vascular network on the FFA. On the OCT, we looked at the type of the pigment epithelial detachment, presence of double layer sign, presence of hemorrhage, hard exudates of fluid, hyperreflective material, and Pachy vessels. The measurements were done by two people, and the measurements were on the central retinal thickness and the subfoveal choroidal thickness. So on the basis of the subfoveal choroidal thickness which we got, we divided the patients into 3 groups. One with thin choroid, where the subfoveal choroidal thickness was lesser than the mean minus 1 standard deviation, and thick choroid, where the subfoveal choroidal thickness was greater than mean plus 1 standard deviation, and the values which lie between these 2 ranges were considered to be in the medium choroid group. We also looked at the treatment modalities which these patients received depending on the site and the activity of the lesion. And basically, these patients were treated either with observation, anti-VEGF injections, PDT, or a combination with focal laser. So at the final follow-up visit, we found we were looking at the best corrected visual acuity, the activity of the disease, the OCT features, and the ICG features. And we also looked at what changes were happening at the central retinal thickness and the subfoveal choroidal thickness. So we used a statistical test with the GraphPad Prism software, and these were the results which we found. So there were 12 eyes with in the thin choroid group, 46 eyes in the medium choroid group, and the thick choroid group was 10 eyes. And we did not find any difference in the demographic features or on the clinical examination features between the 3 groups. When we looked at the OCT parameters, there were a number of variables which we tried to look, and in each of these groups, that is between the thin choroid, the medium choroid, and the thick choroid, we did not find any significant change between the OCT features in this group, and similar with the ICG and the fluorescein angiographic features. So it did not show any features at the long-term visit. When you looked at the follow-ups, these follow-ups on treatment did not, the number of injections which these patients received in the thin choroid, the medium choroid, and the thick choroid group were not significant. They were not statistically significant. And the number of PDT sessions which the patients required were also not statistically significant. Now, looking at the final visit, where you found that the visual acuity did not differ between either of the 3 groups, that there was disease persistence or the disease recurrence rate also did not differ between the three groups. And again, the OCT, the ICT features did not show any variations. What we found on the visual acuity changes between the initial and the final visits were that there was no statistical significance difference between the presenting visual acuity or the final visual acuity in either of the three groups. So the important take-home points which we had from this study were eyes with PCV are known to have a wide range of subfoveal choroidal thickness. There is no difference in the clinical and imaging features between the three groups at the initial and final follow-up visits. The range of the subfoveal choroidal thickness was noted to be much narrower, with the thinnest being around 107 microns and the thickest being 444 microns. Eyes with PCV having a thicker choroid usually present at a younger age, and there is no significance between the OCT and the angiographic features between the three groups, and there is no difference in the functional outcome in the three groups before and after therapy. So when you look at the limitations were, this was a retrospective study. There was a variety of treatment modalities which were given, and the subfoveal choroidal thickness was not measured at the same time. And the future idea is that we need larger prospective longitudinal studies with larger sample size, which is required to evaluate the visual outcome after treatment. So eyes with PCV, they have a choroid varying thickness, and clinical and imaging and treatment responses are similar between the three groups in this study. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ramesh, for a nice presentation. I just wanted to ask you only one question. Now, when the PDT is not available for future, though this was a retrospective analysis for maybe another prospective analysis, do you think you will like to modify your criteria, or you like to add on something in that?
Yeah, so probably PDT, since it's not available, we will have to compare it between the different anti-VEGF groups, especially with the newer molecule coming up. Probably a comparison, head-to-head comparison between aflibercept and probably brolucizumab would be an important thing to compare, especially when the PDT is not available at such scenarios.
Yeah, or maybe it is more beneficial in thicker choroid or a thinner choroid. You know, we need,
Yes.
things we need to look into it. So very nice observation. Thank you so very much for the presentation. And we move on to the next presenter, free paper 936. Dr. Zia will be presenting. Dr. Zia, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, please share your screen.
Can you see my screens?
Yes, yes, everything is visible. Please go ahead.
Good morning. I'm going to discuss a study in which we examined glaucoma in patients with retinitis pigmentosa. So there is a well-established association between RP and glaucoma. Western literature has shown that between 2 to 12% of RP patients have primary open-angle glaucoma. However, the literature on angle closure glaucoma in RP is limited to just case reports and case series. So the first part of our study was to determine the prevalence of primary angle closure disease in patients with retinitis pigmentosa. This was a retrospective review of all RP patients over the age of 10 years attending the ocular genetics clinic. Here, patients undergo a thorough evaluation, detailed history, pedigree charting. In the clinical examination, if any patients are found to have a shallow anterior chamber, high intraocular pressure or cupping, they undergo a glaucoma specialist examination where a gonioscopy and detailed disc examination is done as well. Visual fields and ERG are done where required, and all patients undergo a macular SD-OCT. So 618 RP patients were examined in our clinic during the study period. Of these, 1.3% had primary open-angle glaucoma and 2.3% had primary angle closure glaucoma. So the first point to note is that angle closure glaucoma was more prevalent in the Indian RP population. Secondly, 3.6% were either primary angle closure suspects or had primary angle closure. This means the patients had occludable angles or peripheral anterior synechiae on gonioscopy but had not yet developed glaucoma. So if we look at the prevalence of the entire primary angle closure disease spectrum, that is PACG plus PAC plus PACS, it was 5.9% in the RP population. This is clinically relevant because these patients undergo repeated dilated examinations, and it means 6% of these RP patients require a YAG peripheral iridotomy. How does this data compare to the general population? So if we look at Indian population-based studies, the prevalence of PACG in those over 40 years is about 0.8%. When we looked at our RP population and isolated the patients over 40 years, our prevalence was 3.8%, which is much higher than that of the general population. Therefore, there is an association between RP and PSEG. The second part of the study was done because the identification of glaucomatous damage in RP is challenging. This is because both diseases have RNFL thinning on OCT and visual field loss on perimetry. Hence, there is a need for a biomarker for glaucoma and RP. We know that RP is a disease of photoreceptor degeneration, while glaucoma is characterized by retinal ganglion cell apoptosis. Therefore, our hypothesis was in eyes with RP and glaucoma, the inner macula and OCT imaging will be thinner when compared to eyes with RP alone. To explore this hypothesis, we conducted a study to compare the thickness of different retinal layers on macular OCT in eyes of RP and glaucoma with those of RP alone. This was a case control study, and the participants included cases who had RP and glaucoma, who were compared to controls with only RP, and the two groups were matched for vision and central foveal thickness. We excluded patients with any maculopathy or poor OCT images. All patients underwent a spectralis OCT, including to the total, in addition to the total retinal thickness and individual layers, we also evaluated the ganglion cell complex, which is nothing but the ganglion cell layer, the RNFL, which are the axons of the RGCs, and the IPL layer, which are the dendrites of the RGCs. Statistical analysis was performed using mixed effect models after adjusting for the use of 2 eyes per patient. We had 21 eyes with RP and glaucoma who compared to 26 controls. They were demographically similar. The mean IOP and cup-disc ratio was higher in the cases. Moving on to the macular measurements, the values in black are those of the controls, while those in red are those of patients with RP and glaucoma. So when we looked at the total retinal thickness, there was no difference between the cases and controls in any of the ETDRS sectors. However, when we looked at the ganglion cell layer, the nasal and inferior perifoveal sectors showed that the cases, that is the patients with RP and glaucoma, had thinner GCC compared to the controls. We also examined the outer retinal layers in both groups, and there was no difference between these patients. Therefore, to conclude, almost 6% of RP patients have primary angle closure disease, and therefore a gonioscopy is warranted in all RP patients. Eyes with RP and glaucoma have a thinner GCC layer in some of the perifoveal sectors on macular OCT, and this could be a potential biomarker for glaucomatous damage in this cohort of patients. Future work involves longitudinal studies of patients with RP and glaucoma to monitor progressive changes on the macular OCT and to compare these with other factors such as visual field changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zia. Nice presentation and nice observation. Any specific, modality of, like though you said you are looking for glaucoma very nicely, but choice of, machine, what you like to prefer? You like to go for a Heidelberg platform on this particular subset of patient, or any particular choice is there?
Yes, so the Heidelberg does give us a very detailed evaluation of the retinal layers, and that is what we used over here, the spectralis. And in our future studies also, so now we found a biomarker for glaucomatous damage in these RP patients. When we follow these patients longitudinally, for example, if they have progression on visual fields, we don't know whether it's because of glaucoma or RP. So what we're going to do is identify whether the inner layers are, the GCC is reducing, and then also look at the ellipsoid zone, which is shown really well on the Heidelberg system, and see whether that is reducing to compare these, and then we will plan our management as to whether the glaucoma treatment needs to be increased or whether this is the routine progression of the RP patients. Thank you.
Correct. That's what I wanted to tell you. Before we start, I think Dr. Parth Rana is also there. Dr. Parth, you want to comment on something, please?
Yes, specifically, if they are using spectralis, do you have any used any other machines like Zeiss, Topcon? Have you compared this?
So in RP patients, we have not compared the different machines. In glaucoma patients, we have compared, and we find that the Zeiss system is actually the ideal system in a routine glaucoma evaluation of RNFL and GCC, because it gives us the GC-IPL. But in retina patients, because the outer retinas are so well imaged, we preferred the Heidelberg system for this particular cohort of patients.
Okay, great.
Okay, we move on to the next paper, 1605. Dr. Shraddha, you are there? free paper 1605, Dr. Shraddha, please. Dr. Shraddha Shah.
Dr. Shraddha Shah is there. Please unmute yourself. Dr. Shraddha Shah. Manoj, go to the next paper.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. Free paper 1842, Dr. Nikita. Dr.
Yes.
Nikita, yes, please. Can you share your screen, Dr. Nikita?
Yes. My slides are visible, sir?
Yes, visible. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. My paper is on determinants for anemic retinopathy in Indian population. No financial disclosures. According to WHO, anemia is defined as hemoglobin level less than 13 in men and less than 12 in women. When we looked at the prevalence of anemia among different countries, we found the highest prevalence is noted in Indian and African subcontinents. According to major pharma companies, India has greater than 40% prevalence of anemia. So anemic retinopathy has varied presentations from a simple rod spot to multi-layered hemorrhages such as sub-ILM bleed and pre-retinal hemorrhages. But what is the prevalence of anemic retinopathy? So this paper from European Journal of Hematology said that anemic retinopathy was observed in 28.3% of patients when hemoglobin is less than 8 and thrombocytopenia less than 50,000. They also found that patients who have coexistent thrombocytopenia incidence was increased to 38%. But is the prevalence of anemia between Asian countries and European countries same? No. Is the type of anemia same between countries of two continents? No. Can we take the cutoff for anemia for developing anemic retinopathy from European studies and apply for our Indian population? Definitely not. Do we have any studies from Indian subcontinent on the prevalence and factors causing anemic retinopathy? So we found none. So with this background, our aim of the study was to calculate the prevalence of fundus lesions in anemic patients and define the risk factors for anemic retinopathy. Coming to the methodology, our paper was a prospective cross-sectional cohort study in patients who were diagnosed with anemia between May 2019 to April 2020, who have undergone a dilated fundus examination and documented the images using Topcon and Optos. So presence of any of the following features on retinal examination leads to diagnosis of anemic retinopathy, such as hemorrhages that can present at all the levels of retina and choroid, rod spots, exudates, cotton wool spots, retinal edema, venous tortuosity, optic disc edema or pallor. Following blood parameters were done such as hemoglobin, hematocrit, mean corpuscular volume, mean corpuscular hemoglobin, mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration, platelet count, and the most important one was peripheral smear examination. We have excluded following patients who have coexistent systemic diseases like diabetes, hypertension, and causes of retinopathy mimicking anemic retinopathy. We have also excluded anemic retinopathy occurring as a secondary manifestations with known systemic diseases and following treatment with radiation and chemotherapy. We have also excluded patients who have poor media quality. So once the patients have diagnosed with anemia, we have grouped into two categories. Group 1 is with anemic retinopathy and the other is without anemic retinopathy. So appropriate statistics were done using GraphPad Prism software. Coming to the results, we found 128 eyes of 70 patients, out of which we have 38 eyes of 23 patients in group 1 and 90 eyes of 47 patients in group 2. So when we looked at two groups, no anemic retinopathy versus anemic retinopathy group, we found age and gender has no significant relation. Likewise, type of anemia and the visual acuity. So there is a frequency distribution of different features of anemic retinopathy. We found sub-ILM bleed has a majority, approximately 35%, and following the other manifestations. When we looked at the blood parameters between two groups, we found hemoglobin and hematocrit has significantly lower values in the anemic retinopathy group compared to the without anemic retinopathy group. ROC curve analysis also shows that hemoglobin and pad cell volume has the maximum area under the curve. When we looked at the cutoff values, hemoglobin less than 8.95 has sensitivity of 86% and specificity of 69% to develop anemic retinopathy, and hematocrit less than 30.5 has 80% sensitivity and 53.2% specificity to develop anemic retinopathy. Multivariate analysis also showed that hemoglobin and PCV are the most important determinants factors for anemic retinopathy. So our study, important take-home results of our study are severe anemia either due to reduced hemoglobin or hematocrit played a significant role in the pathogenesis of anemic retinopathy. The prevalence of anemic retinopathy in our study was 29.6%, which is not the true prevalence. From the ROC curve analysis, cutoff value of HB less than 8.9 and hematocrit less than 30.5 has the highest sensitivity to predict the occurrence of anemic retinopathy. The bivariate regression analysis also showed that hemoglobin and hematocrit are the equally important determinants for anemic retinopathy, and the rest of the blood indices doesn't have any correlation. There are few limitations to our study, such as small sample size, disproportionate number of cases between two groups, absence of subgroup analysis with respect to age, gender, and type of anemia. To conclude, retinopathy is a frequent finding in anemic patients with low hemoglobin less than 9 and hematocrit less than 30%. Thus, it is recommended that all patients having low hemoglobin and low hematocrit undergo a dilated fluorescein. Thank you.
Thank you for a nice presentation, Dr. Nikita. Totally agree with you that this is a small subset of patient, but very important subset of patient which often gets overlooked. And presence of sub-ILM bleed, as rightly pointed out with you. Specifically, do you look for any clinical signs in the retinal evaluation apart from those which you have mentioned already? But how will you say that this patient needs an anemic workup? Any take-home messages on that?
We see that all the sub-ILM bleed, multi-layered hemorrhages, rod spots mainly, sir.
So basically looking for the clinical signs of, which are not fitting into the diabetic retinopathy subgroup. Dr. Parth, you want to add something on this?
Definitely, as she told, usually we are seeing rod spots first in this kind of retinopathy, and if hemoglobin is less, I think all the patients should undergo dilated fundus examination, and if ultrawide field fundus imaging is available, that is quite useful, which we use routinely here, and that is quite useful in undilated. We can see this kind of patients. Good presentation, Nikita.
Thank you so much. Let's move on. Thank you so much for the inputs. Let's move on to the next free paper 1851. Dr. Sneha Batra.
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Yeah, please share your screen.
Can I start?
Yes, please.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Sneha Batra, and I'm here to present our paper on diabetic retinopathy, fixing the missing link study, prevalence data from West Bengal. Our study was conducted with the help of a research grant from the Academic and Research Committee of AIOS. So diabetes mellitus is another pandemic which has affected the Indian population silently but severely. And even though it is said that the Indian population has lower prevalence of diabetic retinopathy compared to the Western population, it is the sheer number of people affected which has made it a major concern for all of us. There have been a number of epidemiological studies done, but as can be seen from this chart, 8 out of those 11 studies have been done in the southern Indian population. And there is very limited literature from the East. And in fact, ours is the first DR prevalence data from the state of West Bengal. The study was conducted with a total of 39 camps over 14 districts over a period of 17 months. The aim was to gather the prevalence data for diabetic retinopathy among diabetic population in West Bengal, and we also wanted to compare the data between the rural and the urban population. One of the most unique things about this study was that the subject set was taken neither from the population nor from the eye hospital, but the diabetologist or the treating physician conducted these camps at their own clinics among their own patient pool. A team of an ophthalmologist, optometrist, and a counselor visited the campsite on the day of the camp. We included all patients with a known history of diabetes mellitus, but excluded those where significant media opacity did not allow fundus evaluation. Diabetic retinopathy grading was done on field by an ophthalmologist with the help of an indirect ophthalmoscope. Simultaneously, a fundus photograph was also taken by the optometrist with the help of the fundus on phone non-mydriatic camera. Statistical analysis was done with the help of software R. A total of 1,553 subjects were screened with a rural to urban ratio of 60 to 40. The prevalence of diabetic retinopathy in West Bengal overall in our study was 21.51%. But what was a very shocking data was that the prevalence was seen to be almost double in the rural areas as compared to the urban areas. The prevalence went up with age and diabetic age. It was also interesting to note that the awareness of diabetic blindness, as it went low, the control of the systemic disease was also lost more and more. One very dismaying fact was that despite the fact that all our patients were under the treatment of a treating physician, 33% remained unaware of the fact that diabetes could be a cause of blindness. And this unawareness was even more in the rural areas. This highlights that somewhere there is a missing link between the treating physicians and the ophthalmologists treating a similar disease spectrum. The awareness of diabetic blindness went up as the diabetic age went up, probably after an eye disease has already developed and the patient has now contacted an ophthalmologist. Again, it was very dismaying to note that despite being under the treatment of a treating physician, more than half the subjects had not had a comprehensive eye checkup in the last 1 year, out of which a substantial 19% had never had an eye checkup since the diabetes was diagnosed. Once again, highlighting the missing link between the treating physicians and the ophthalmologists. The last eye checkup rates were even poorer for the rural areas. Loss of visual acuity went up with diabetic age. So what we want to highlight from this study is that this epidemic of diabetic retinopathy is now shifting from the urban to the rural areas. And this is compounded by the fact that there is an unmet need for specialists in these areas, as well as the fact that the awareness of diabetic blindness is much lower in these areas. So what is the solution? The chain of epidemiology shows that the loss of control of systemic disease and the lower compliance to eye checkup all stem from the fact that there is lower awareness of diabetic blindness in this area, and this is where the chain needs to be broken. But the question is, who is going to do this? Because at this point, the patient has still not contacted the ophthalmologist. So we propose that the only solution is to fix the missing link between the ophthalmologists and our diabetic colleagues, and it is only when this particular chain is fixed that these patients will be referred early in the stage where they can still be treated. The limitations of my study include not classifying patients into type 1 and type 2 diabetes mellitus and not being able to assess the inter-observer variability between the various on-field ophthalmologists, but the strengths being that this is one of the first studies which gives a direct comparison between the rural and urban population from the same state. I would like to conclude by saying that the prevalence of diabetic retinopathy in West Bengal is almost similar to the rest of the country, but the stark difference between the rural and urban areas is something which is a highlighting factor of our study. And it is now imperative to shift the onus of management from tertiary to primary prevention and from urban to rural areas by fixing the missing link between the treating physicians and the ophthalmologists. These are my references. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sneha, for the nice presentation. I will also request you to continue this study, on a long-term follow-up, maybe about 5 to 10 years, so that we'll have a data on systemic as well as ophthalmic management of these patients. We were one of the first ones to show the rural-urban divide on diabetic retinopathy in 2007-8, and I think there are a lot of data from Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu available on this, so you can have a comparative analysis as how these longitudinal epidemiological studies were followed up.
Yes, sir.
But in all, very nice work, commendable work. Not many people try to venture into this. Dr. Parth, you want to add something, please?
Yes, sir. We are also doing same study here. We are doing Ahmedabad District Diabetic Retinopathy Screening Study, address program. And in that also we have seen the same results. The main thing what we are facing here, even when doctors are telling, when physicians are telling patients to come to ophthalmologists, they are not coming. So we have to go to them. Patients are not going to come to, we have fixed that. So that is the main issue. We are going to the physician's place and we are doing the camps with the Fundus on phone. And one more good thing I want to tell, there's an AI in this Fundus on phone that you can use, and that will be very useful.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so AI is going to be the way forward. That is what we know that. Okay, thank you so very much again. We move on to the free paper 2133. Dr. Kshitij, you are there? Dr. Kshitij Kumar?
Yes, I am there.
Yeah, can you please share your screen?
Okay, is my screen visible now?
No, Kshitij, not yet. Dr. Sneha, have you unshared?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Kshitij, can you go on? Yes.
Yeah.
Now it's visible, Kshitij.
We can see
Please
it.
go.
We can see it.
Okay. Please
So
go
very
ahead,
good morning.
Kshitij.
So very good morning to all. I'm here to present my pre-paper on RINS protocol for retinal vein occlusion, and I don't have any financial disclosure. So as we all know that retinal vein occlusion is the second most common retinal vascular disorder after diabetic retinopathy, and the pivotal trials like Geneva, Horizon, Copernicus have shown the efficacy of monotherapy. However, the mean number of injections which may be given, may be required over a period of a year, may be as high as 9 injections. So the lacuna knowledge is that although there are several papers describing the efficacy of monotherapy, as well as some papers describing the combination therapy, there is no paper or there is no study which has described phage combination therapy from our setting. And hence the aim of the study was to describe a novel phage combination therapy for retinal vein occlusion related macular edema using the RINS protocol, which stands for ranibizumab injection and steroid implant Ozurdex with laser photocoagulation, aiming to standardize and a local treatment strategy. So it was a retrospective intervention single center case series. The study period was between November 2018 to Feb 2020 with a strict exclusion and inclusion criteria. Coming on to the RINS protocol, it stands for ranibizumab injection and steroid implant Ozurdex with laser photocoagulation. And once the patient was diagnosed with a retinal vein occlusion related macular edema, and on OCT there was a macular edema, the patient was subjected to preloading doses of either Accentrix or Razumab as per the patient's choice. And following the last injection at 3 months, if there was a rebound macular edema, then the patient was subjected to angiography. And if on angiography there was presence of retinal ischemia, then the laser was given to non-perfused retina along with repeat anti-VEGF injection. If there was no retinal ischemia in presence of rebound edema, then the patient was subjected to DEX implant. However, the macula was dry following 3 loading doses. Then the patient was followed up 2 monthly, and following angiography, if there was a retinal ischemia, then just the laser was done. So this is the flow chart of the RINS protocol. The primary outcome measure was change in BCV and CMT, and the secondary outcome measures were the frequency of injections and intervals of adjunctive other adjunctive therapies. There were 122 eyes of 120 patients with a mean age of 60.52 years. Bilateral involvement was present in 4 eyes of 2 patients. 67% of the cases were of BRVO, of which 40% cases were of macular BRVO. These are the representative images of various type of retinal vein occlusion studied using this protocol. So this is a case of bilateral non-ischemic CRVO. Another case which had simultaneous presentation with IT BRVO and macular BRVO. Coming on to the results, the mean number of injections which was given was 3.78 over a period of 8.21. And we can see that the visual acuity recovered from 0.78 to 0.38, which was significant. And the central macular thickness decreased from 598 to 249 microns, which was again significant. Another representative image, which is showing very good recovery with just 3 loading doses. And if we compare the Accentrix versus the Razumab arm, then 63 eyes were there in Accentrix and 69 eyes were given Razumab. However, the visual acuity, which improved significantly in both arms, and it was not statistically significant difference was found between the two. Again, the mean central macular thickness decrease was statistically was good to a good extent in both the arms. And if we can see here that if we compare BRVO versus CRVO, then the visual acuity gain was better in BRVO compared to CRVO. However, such a difference was not found between BRVO, CRVO, or hemi-CRVO. As we can see, the central macular thickness recovery was very good in both the arms, in all the 3 types of. And when on angiography, if the macular ischemia was not present in 58 eyes with 81 eyes showing rebound edema, so they were given DEX implant, and 7 eyes received 2 DEX implants. And we can see that following the DEX implant, the visual acuity again recovered from 0.73 to 0.5, and with a decrease in central macular thickness from 474 to 249. And it was given at one DEX implant was given at a mean of 4.9 months. So this is a case where there was no ischemia, there was a rebound edema, and DEX implant showed made a very good recovery. And these were the cases where 2 DEX implant was given, and again the visual acuity recovered The central macular thickness following the rebound edema recovered from 607, 560 to 322. And these we can see here that there was at 5 months and 8 months there was rebound edema with no ischemia, and hence 2 DEX implants were given. Then coming on to the ischemic arm, where which was present in 23 eyes of the 81 eyes with rebound edema, and the laser was given to 23 eyes with ischemia, and 49 received 1 additional injection, 9 eyes received 2 additional injection at a mean of 4.56 months, and we can see that visual acuity recovered and the central macular thickness also decreased with laser and repeat anti-VEGF injection. And we can see here on ultra-wide field fundus fluorescence angiography at 5 months with rebound edema, there was a retinal ischemia, and hence the laser was done. And another representative case, which is again showing overall the total number of lasers were 79, and this was just only laser was done, no rebound edema. So coming on to the conclusion, the stage combination therapy shows 3.8 anti-VEGF injection and 1 DEX implant recovered the visual acuity by 85%, 64% at 6/12 or better, and 80% achieved completely dry fovea. Hence, this study provides a guidance on pragmatic combination treatment for RVO and shares actual real-world experience, including subgroup analysis. Thank
you. Thank you, Kshitij, for an excellent presentation and highlighting the role of wide field imaging. Any imaging platform of choice when you want to look into these parameters?
Ideally, it should be an ultra-wide field angiography, and since at Disha, I'm working with Disha, and we are lucky that we are having ultra-wide field fundus fluorescence angiography, so we make a very good use of it, particularly for these RVO patients following preloading doses. We do angiography quite a lot with using the Optos angiography platform.
What about just with OCTA,
Yeah, OCTA we just recently acquired. So I guess, but again, OCTA would rather, focus more on the macular ischemia rather than the peripheral ischemia. So latest machines are coming which can show ultra-wide field Opta. But yeah, I think it would be, we can probably do with montage images. Maybe we can come up with an arm comparing Opta versus.
That's what I wanted to say. Like montages, we can really look into that. Dr. Parth, you want to add something, please?
Definitely one thing, like when you did laser, and if there was a fluid there at macula, what you did? First injection or laser? If you find a shape, you wanted to do laser.
I did not do laser to the macula. We did laser to the peripheral retinal ischemic area to decrease the anti-VEGF component, and then we after post laser at 1 week or 2 weeks we entered the eye with the injection. So I did not do laser for the macular edema. We did laser mainly for the retinal ischemia, that is peripheral ischemia.
Even though macular edema was there, you went ahead with laser or not? That's what I'm asking.
No, we did not do laser, but mainly, I mean, we maintained at least 1,000 microns away from the fovea. We maintained a distance of that while doing laser to the peripheral ischemia.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on to the next presentation. This is by JKOS Ophthalmological Society. Very heartening to see paper coming from a state society. Dr. Orfa, you are there?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, can you please share your screen?
Yes, sir.
This is Jammu Kashmir, isn't it? JKOS?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. And that was this was the best paper there, is it? In the state conference?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you so much.
So
Please.
is my screen visible?
Yes, visible.
Good morning, everyone. Today my topic is going to be assessment of vitreoretinal interface alterations in diabetic macular edema treated with intravitreal anti-VEGF injections. I don't have any financial disclosure in this study. So as we all know, diabetic retinopathy, it's a major cause of blindness worldwide. At present, we can see more than 93 million people who suffer from diabetic retinopathy. And by this ratio, it is predicted that by 2030, around 430 million people will be affected if there is not any proper like screening is not done, if it continues at the same rate. And in diabetic retinopathy, as we know, diabetic macular edema, it is the most important cause of visual loss. After demonstration of efficacy of various therapies targeting the VEGF by a number of clinical trials, we know that intravitreal anti-VEGFs have become the treatment of choice for treating the central diabetic macular edema. And in these patients, the role of vitreomacular interface, it is key in the emergence and progression and response to the treatment in several retinal diseases. Epiretinal membrane existence in a patient with diabetic macular edema, it serves as an important clinical factor during the reduction, in the therapeutic effects of anti-VEGF. It can also lead to limited visual acuity improvement and also the necessity of surgical intervention as a part of maculopathy treatment. The possible contribution of anti-VEGF agents for the fibrotic process, it has been proposed previously, but recently it was reported that bevacizumab can exert a pro-fibrotic effect in human umbilical vein endothelial cells in vitro. So previous studies have documented tractional retinal detachment in eyes with severe PDR following intravitreal anti-VEGF injections. So our aim in this study, it was to see whether the anti-VEGFs that we are giving to the patients, whether they have any kind of fibrotic effect for the development of vitreomacular interface abnormalities in diabetic eyes, those eyes that were not having any fibrotic changes or any membrane before we gave them the injection. So ours was a hospital-based retrospective observational study. It was conducted in SKIMS Medical College. So we included 101 eyes in our study, and the patients with diabetic macular edema were involved. They at least completed 9 months of the follow-up. So our patients were divided into two groups: 50 eyes with anti-VEGF group and that had diabetic macular edema and received intravitreal injections, and 51 eyes of the control group that were without significant diabetic macular edema, though diabetic changes were found in the fundus. The groups were comparable in terms of diabetes duration as well as the HbA1c levels. So most importantly, our inclusion criteria was we included those patients in our study who had diabetic macular edema more than 320 microns, as was measured by SD-OCT, and with loss of visual acuity. So the exclusion criteria was existence of any other retinal disease like ARMD, vascular occlusion. Patients, those were having glaucoma, they were also excluded from the study. Previous treatment for diabetic macular edema, like prior photocoagulation or any other intraocular surgery, it was those patients were excluded. Patients with iris neovascularization, any intraocular inflammation, any history of trauma, they were also excluded from the study. So our testing protocols was BCVA, best corrected visual acuity. It was measured at the initial, that is at the baseline visit of the patient. Slit lamp biomicroscopy was done in order to see the anterior pole before mydriasis, to identify any media opacity, to identify any iris neovascularization, which could hamper our results while we were dealing with the study. Then we had to do intraocular pressure measurement, gonioscopy, direct and indirect ophthalmoscopy, and then fundus fluorescein angiography of the patients was also done. And the assessment of the vitreoretinal interface was done by spectral domain OCT for the quantitative measurement of the macular edema and to see development of any other vitreomacular interface abnormality after we gave them the intravitreal injections of anti-VEGFs, like epiretinal membrane formation, like vitreomacular traction development, and macular hole formation in few patients which was seen. So visual acuity was measured and CMT was measured at the baseline. Then all the patients, they received at least one VEGF, but wherever required, we had to give multiple doses, we gave it. So follow-up measurement was initially done at 1 week after the injection and then monthly thereafter. In patients that required multiple doses, as I already said, so repeated injections were given wherever it was required. After proper statistical analysis and after seeing, like in the control group and in our study group, the age was comparable. It was statistically insignificant. So gender distribution, there was again no difference based upon the gender distribution of the patients. And the systemic diseases, which is an important factor in this study. We only included those patients in the study, and like when both the groups were comparable in terms of hypertension and in terms of any coronary artery disease. So diabetes duration and the HbA1c levels were also comparable for both the groups. So then what we find after completion of the follow-up in these patients, the case group, that is those they were given the injections, we found that out of all, around 12% of our patients.
Your
Around
time's up. Please sum up.
Okay, sorry. Around 12% of the patients developed epiretinal membrane in our case group, whereas in control group, only 2% of the patients develop epiretinal membranes. And vitreomacular traction was developed in 6% of the patients, and macular hole in 4% of the patients.
I'm really sorry, ma'am, but due to the lack of time, we will really have to stop.
So I'm just moving to the end. So in the conclusion in our study, it was that the patients with significant diabetic macular edema who went these intravitreal injections, 22% of the eyes developed these changes as compared to 4% in the control groups. And this difference was statistically significant. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Orfa. Commendable work again. Dr. Parth, you want to give any comment before I give my comment?
You told about VMD. If you found VMD, did you continue with the injections or not?
Sorry, sir, you're not audible.
You told about vitreomacular tractions in your cases.
Yes,
so
sir.
if you found vitreomacular tractions, did you continue with the injections or not?
So we continued with the injection, but at the same time, if treatment was required, like ILM peeling and all, if the traction was so severe, so that patient was followed with that treatment as well. If surgical intervention was required, we did that in that patient.
Okay.
So basically, you want to say, yeah, you know, any kind of traction maculopathy has to be dealt differently. Yeah, that's a
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So thank you very much for a nice presentation. May I call upon for free paper 1605 Dr. Shraddha for our presentation? This will be last.
Yes, sir.
Yes, please.
Yes, sir.
Can you share your screen, please?
So just
There's a green button on the bottom showing.
so I'm pressing that. It's not.
What happened?
It's just.
It will show multiple screens. You have to select your presentation there.
First of all, open your PowerPoint and then go there.
So the PowerPoint is open. So.
Okay, no problem. Don't get panic. Don't get panic. Close everything and just try to re-log in.
I'll exit and come back.
Yes, please do it fast.
Okay.
In the meanwhile, we could have the next one, but I believe
Yeah,
that
we
was
have Nikhil. This is the last presentation. That's what I was waiting. I gave her a reminder call.
So
this is
the last presentation, is the presenter present?
Yeah. She's just logging in again, Amit.
So the session is over. If she's just logged in now, session is over. We should not take it.
No,
9:25.
she logged
the
in.
session
She
was
logged in
supposed to be
before.
over.
She logged in before. Just have a quick presentation.
Yeah, just have a quick presentation so that we finish on time. It's already late.
Yeah, we will finish on time. Don't worry.
It's 9:25 already.
Yeah. Dr. Shraddha, your screen is visible. Please do a quick presentation. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Good morning. I'm Dr. Shraddha, and my paper for discussion is evaluation of pan-retinal photocoagulation on macular perfusion in eyes with proliferative diabetic retinopathy using optical coherence tomography angiography. PRP, as we all know, is a standard treatment modality for severe NPDR and PDR. The vascular effects of PRP, that is alteration of blood-retinal barrier, ocular blood flow, and choroidal circulation, have been documented. Studies have shown that PRP tends to cause an increase in the cytokines and interleukin levels, resulting in increase in capillary dropout, altering the macular perfusion.
OCT angiography images the retinal blood flow by detecting changes in the refractivity from the movement of the erythrocytes. Using the fast track technology and the OMAG algorithm, the images are scanned. With the help of the Angioplex software available in the Cirrus HD OCT, these scans are then given as a series of superficial, deep, and avascular retinal maps. One can then visualize the vessel density, vessel perfusion, foveal avascular zone, and its various parameters. So what is the purpose of our study? The vessel density at the level of the SCP and DCP is an objective marker for microvascular alteration. This is known to decrease in diabetic retinopathy states. Hence, we decided to evaluate the effect of panretinal photocoagulation on macular perfusion by comparing the size of the foveal avascular zone and the vessel density at the levels of the SCP and DCP before and after PRP. Our study included 29 eyes of treatment-naive patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus with clinical and angiographic evidence of proliferative diabetic retinopathy as documented by fundus fluorescence angiography. All patients underwent a baseline evaluation which recorded the best corrected visual acuity, intraocular pressure, and slit-lamp biomicroscopy using 90 lens. The central retinal thickness and the OCT angiographic scans measuring the vessel density and the foveal avascular zone were taken. All patients then underwent 3 sittings of panretinal photocoagulation using double frequency Nd:YAG laser with parameters of 200 micron spot size, 0.1 to 0.2 second duration, 200 to 400 milliwatt intensity with an average total of 2000 to 3000 spots. All patients then underwent similar scans in 6 months of follow-up. A 6 by 6 millimeter standard scan of the affected eye was taken. The foveal region was marked as 1 millimeter diameter from the center and parafoveal region a 2.5 millimeter diameter encircling it. The parafoveal region was further divided into superior, temporal, inferior, and nasal quadrants. Density at the level of the SCP and DCP and the foveal avascular zone at the level of the DCP were calculated using a customized algorithm available in the MATLAB software. The FAZ at the level of the SCP and the central retinal thickness, foveal and parafoveal thickness were calculated using a built-in software available in the Cirrus HD OCT. The results were as follows. This graph shows the central retinal thickness values at the foveal and parafoveal zone before and after panretinal photocoagulation. At the foveal region, it is 272 microns, which is reduced down to 267, which is not statistically significant enough. Vessel density at the level of the SCP shows a decline in the values. However, this decline was not seen to be statistically significant enough. Similar trends were noted at the level of the DCP as well. A steady state was maintained at the level of the foveal avascular zone before and after PRP. So what does the study add? PRP as a destructive procedure can result in complications such as diabetic macular edema or worsening of the pre-existing macular edema. However, there was a stabilization of the best corrected visual acuity and central retinal thickness at the foveal and parafoveal zones, suggesting that PRP is a safe treatment modality for PDR and does not necessarily contribute to DME. Foveal avascular zone, as we all know, is altered in diabetic retinopathy states and it's larger. A steady state of foveal avascular zone suggests that the damage caused by the hyperglycemia in our cases is irreversible, and PRP does not reverse this damage, but it can prevent further enlargement by reducing the VEGF production. Microcirculation, as demonstrated by vessel density of SCP and DCP, is known to decrease in diabetic retinopathy states. However, there was no further decrease in the vessel density of the SCP and DCP following PRP, suggesting no alteration in the macular perfusion. Our study is in concurrence with another study by Nuroso et al. The only difference being the laser delivery system was different. This is the first study conducted in an Indian population to elaborate the changes occurring at the macula and its perfusion status in eyes with proliferative diabetic retinopathy treated with panretinal photocoagulation using the novel non-invasive Angioplex platform and single spot double frequency Nd:YAG laser delivery system.
So, Manoj?
Yeah, thank you so very much for the nice presentation. Due to paucity of time, I think we will have to close the session. Over to you, Amit.
Yeah, so thank you all the speakers. Thank you all the speakers and participants for making this session a great success. I request all the speakers who were there in the session to please exit as a panelist so that we have the next session.